Final Fantasy VII Remake is straight up a badass video game. This short opening sentiment is one that I don't want to see get lost throughout this review because the game does have numerous issues within its gameplay, story, and even its presentation to a degree. And I plan on going into those weaknesses throughout this review, but none of them are enough to hamper and diminish the experience, and trust me, it's cool as all hell. The story, while incomplete for now, is full of action, drama, heartfelt moments, and signs of character growth. The presentation alls with stunning graphical locales and environments, which is also accompanied by a strong OST that supports the action that's unfolding wonderfully. And the gameplay features many gripping encounters with an incredibly lengthy roster of opponents who are all ready to do battle in a pioneering new combat style that blends the fast-paced mayhem of modern action games with the original turn-based mechanics that allowed this series to flourish all those years ago. I'm also happy to report that all of this remains true even if you, like myself, are a complete newcomer to the Final Fantasy series and chose to make this title your first foray into the run of critically acclaimed games from Square Enix. For the most part, the rhythms of combat are easy to sink into, and the story moves at a pace that's easy to follow even if you aren't familiar with these characters at all. And I can only imagine how special this game must be for all of you out there who played the original at release and are truly seeing the images that you conjured up in your imagination now coming true in all their glory here in 2020. So yes, I am about to criticize this game, and please don't let that take away from your experience. But keep in mind, I don't have the nostalgia to fall back on, and in part, I think this allows me to see the game more clearly for what it is, at least in terms of flaws. Final Fantasy VII Remake is an excellent game filled with badass moments, memorable characters, and a story that surprisingly feels open-ended and concluded at the same time. But it isn't perfect. So with that, welcome to my review of Final Fantasy VII Remake. As with all of my reviews, I like to start with the biggest component of the title, the one that the developers seem to want to emphasize the most, and for Final Fantasy VII Remake, the story would be that. We of course experienced the controversy during the game's development, as well as through its release, that this game wouldn't be the entirety of the original game, remade and reimagined. It never sat right with me that this $60 game wouldn't be the full experience, but now that I've completed it, I have a lot less of an issue with that. In fact, my only concern isn't from a storytelling perspective, but instead just the logistics of it. I'm stuck with questions like, when will the next game be out? Will it try to change up this game's combat and evolve it, or keep it the same? Will our gear and stats carry over? How many more games will there be, and will they all be full priced? Will they be exclusive to the next generation hardware, forcing players to upgrade just to finish the entirety of it all? There's just so many questions like these that are unanswered and will probably remain so for the foreseeable future. But you know what? That's okay. I won't be recapping the entirety of the story here since this is more of a review than a critique, but I will say that what surprised me most about the ending was that it felt conclusive to the events that are pictured throughout the game. At least that's true for the most important characters, our heroes. Some characters and their motivations were left vague, especially for someone who didn't play the original, but for the most part the story wraps up in a cohesive way. By the time the credits roll, the main plot points pertaining to our heroes have been pretty much wrapped up while leaving a lot of room to take the next game forward. It kind of reminds me of the original Star Wars. It tells its own story, but leaves some wiggle room at the end that allowed the sequels to blossom into what they became. You get a full narrative within this game, one that's going to take you probably 25 to 30 hours to see through to the end, and it flows with high points and low points for our characters, as you'd expect in any story. So I'm trying to keep it as vague as possible, but I can't reiterate enough how surprised I was to see the story conclude in such a satisfying way. I've learned from friends that this story has changed up some of the beats of the original story, as if this is a reimagining of that tale that still shares many of the same strokes as the 1997 title. You're introduced to these ghosts, which are called Whispers, fairly early into the game, and it seems that many of their appearances are tied to changes that the development team has made to the story. They show up a lot throughout the narrative and often act as plot armor to protect Cloud, Aerith, Barrett, and Tifa, but they are contextualized so well into the story that they don't feel like narrative tools that are meant to protect characters, but instead like natural beings who are a part of the greater magical universe. At least that's how I felt about them by the time the credits rolled. Many fans are speculating that the story may go in a different direction from the original in subsequent parts, which has quickly led to an active subreddit eager to pick this game apart and hypothesize what may come next. Now, a major spoiler here for the original game, so skip ahead 20 seconds if you don't want to hear this, but some people are even questioning major events of the story, like if Aerith will actually be killed by Sephiroth in the remake. I'm not sure if it's going to happen or not, but it's awesome that this game leaves some wiggle room for interpretation by fans, at least from what I've been told by those who played and loved the original. Anyway, that's all for the future to reveal. For now, what I can say is that Cloud, Tifa, Barrett, and Aerith won me over, particularly during the game's conclusion. Cloud is stoic with lots of barriers, but he learns to drop the loner act and let people into his life as the game unfolds. Barrett is loud, brash, and aggressive, but it becomes clear through the narrative that he isn't a jerk or a bad guy, but instead quite the opposite, a very caring man, friend, and father who remains ultra passionate about his mission to save the planet from being harvested to death. For me, he was easily the most likable character. I loved Barrett. And no spoilers here, but this game does something with him in its last few chapters that really opened my eyes to how much I appreciated his character and the admiration I had for his presence throughout the game. And if you did play the remake already and you completed it, you probably know the Chapter 17 moment that I'm referring to, and for me, wow, that was wild. And for Aerith, she starts off as a sweet and innocent girl who is quickly revealed to be much more than meets the eye. In fact, she may be the most powerful being in this universe, and her backstory and abilities is what drives the narrative forward. For me, she did end up being the weakest character simply because a lot of her power and mythology was left too vague for an outsider. We're told she's extremely gifted and a descendant from a powerful bloodline, but we never really see it in action. But then of course we have Tifa, who is a totally badass woman who is just as quick to help a friend as she is to knock out an enemy's teeth. She doesn't need armor or giant weapons or a cannon for an arm or literal magic to make sure anyone in her way is thoroughly crushed. She's fantastic. And all of these characters are faced with triumph and trials throughout the story, and they really come together as a group with a shared mission. There's an unspoken bond between these four people by the game's conclusion, and you as a player feel like you're right there with them throughout the experience. My only pause for concern with the narrative here is that, unlike our main cast of heroes, the story beats of side characters and villains feel rushed and unfinished. There's a local mob boss and total pervy slob of a man named Don Corneo who escapes a little over halfway through the game, and his story feels unfinished despite dominating the middle sections of this title. Along with him, there's Leslie, his right-hand man, whose motivation is introduced, expanded on, and concluded in the span of about 30 minutes, and then he never shows up again. I don't understand what the point of fleshing him out was, unless he is to appear again later on in the next games, but for now, it just feels like a lost cause. And finally, there's other characters, specifically villains related to Shinra, who is the main antagonistic organization of the title, who are just forgotten about and left unresolved in the last hour of the game as it really switches to a different goal for our heroes. And some of these Shinra characters played vital roles in pushing this game's story forward, and to see their fates uncertain feels like a cop-out in order to allow the last hour of this game to feel like a prequel to the next game's story. That's my main gripe with this tale. Our heroes' adventures feel concluded, at least to the events that happened in this game, but the antagonists of the tale are just left dangling. Outside of that, my only nitpicks of the story would be a few super cliche moments that pull you out of the story with weak narrative beats. For example, there's a few times in the story where major enemy leaders are convinced they've won, and so they do that normal monologue thing where they just tell you about their master plan, only to see you of course escape and stop them. However, they did at least recognize this cliche and poke fun of it, which is great. I love those moments with Don Corneo where he kind of, acknowledges this. Besides that, there's also tons of moments where major characters could have easily been killed off if the plot didn't demand that they live. For example, in one scene, Don Corneo looks like he's about to die, but his would-be assassin gives him a chance to escape when he easily could have killed him in a surprise burst. And later in the game, Cloud should have killed a major Shinra leader, but instead manages to take out all the goons around him while leaving him completely untouched. Oh, and did I mention he does all of this by flying through the air on a motorcycle? It's awesome looking, but it's super contrived after further examination, and you realize this guy should have died too. So yes, some of the major villains of this title have their fates left up in the air, in fact all of them are, but yet the events of this game do feel concluded, like it's a chapter in a bigger story. It feels like an epic slice of a grander tale, with the promise that the next section of the story will be even more robust and epic than the last. I almost didn't purchase this game solely on the fact that I thought it would be an incomplete story, but by the time the credits rolled, I felt satisfied and am eagerly awaiting what comes next for this crew. So that brings us to the gameplay section of the review, and it's here where I think the title stumbles the most. I want to take some time to look at exploration, side quests, and leveling before doing a big dive into the game's combat system, so let's get started. 7 Remake is a very linear title with the traditional pathing system of many JRPGs like Persona 5. This leaves very little room for true exploration, but the game does make some effort towards allowing the player to explore a few cities and towns. Sectors 6 and 7 are fully explorable, alongside of the hustling and bustling city of Wall Market, and oh my god, I almost said Walmart right there. But anyway, there's lots of shops to check out with different weapons, items, optional minigame challenges, materia, and music for you to collect. I'm not saying that you can get lost in these areas for hours and hours, they aren't that big, but they do offer a nice change of pace when compared to the dungeons. And speaking of dungeons, yes, they do have a little bit of exploration as well, with some hidden chests tucked away just off the main path for you to get valuable items to enhance your combat experience. If you've played just about any JRPG before, the setup of the world will feel immediately familiar, sometimes for the worse though. Take for example the abundance, and I do mean abundance, of sections that make you slow walk or crawl through tight spaces to give the game time to load. And I'm only half kidding when I say that this game has as many combat encounters as it does times when you'll duck under a slab of fallen building or squeeze through some pipes in order to progress forward. It sometimes tanks the pace as you'll be sprinting forward towards your next objective only to do this slow crawl through an air duct to make progress. It just feels so antithetical to the fast-paced action of the game. Obviously, this isn't the only game that suffers from this, and it isn't a major issue. In fact, I wouldn't even bring it up at all if it weren't for the fact that there are just so many sequences like this. I mean, truly, you are going to be seeing a lot of them as you move through the main story. And for those of you wondering, the reason that I keep saying the main story is because, yes, 7 Remake also contains side stories that feel reminiscent of those found in the Yakuza games. And honestly, I should slap myself for typing that and now saying it, because the ones found here, while structured very similar to the side content of the Yakuza games, are simply atrocious when it comes to the actual content. There's no sugarcoating it. The side quests in Final Fantasy VII Remake are poorly designed, boring, and ultimately pretty forgettable. There's 18 chapters throughout the main campaign, but during 5 of them, you're given the opportunity to complete side quests for additional resources, currency, and items. A typical side quest follows one of 3 paths. The first would be to go on what feels like a never-ending loop of talking to people who tell you to go talk to someone, who also tells you to go talk to someone, who then tells you to go talk to the first person you talk to finish the quest. The second would be, quote-unquote, searching the surrounding area for 3 of a particular item and then bringing them back to the quest giver. And finally, the only halfway decent side quests are the ones that see you engaging in combat against some unique enemies. But normally, you don't get to those enemies until you've talked to numerous other characters, which means spending a lot of time just walking around endlessly. The main issue here is that the side quests are boring, repetitive, and don't feature many memorable encounters. And compounding this issue is a few others. The first would be that the mapping system of the game is total garbage. It's always super zoomed in on the mini-map, and the main map is disconnected into chunks, which makes it hard to tell which sections connect and which are totally separate. It's terrible. It can make navigation feel like a tedious chore, which really hampers those side missions where you're asked to talk to multiple people at different locations. On top of that, the quest marking system is just so terrible as well. Every side quest stays active on your minimap, meaning you'll have tons of little icons that all look the same, flooding it when you just want to tackle one of them at a time. But when you are close enough to the next objective in the physical space, they do project a marker that lets you know what you need to talk to or how to progress the story. And that sounds nice, but sometimes it's completely broken. I mean, there was one instance where a marker appeared, but the NPC tied to the marker did not appear, and I thought the quest was glitched, only to discover that I needed to complete another side quest in order to get that NPC to spawn for this side quest. Well, guess what? The other side quest had an annoying combat encounter that I chose not to complete after 4 failed attempts, meaning that NPC never spawned for me, and I just was stuck with this marker that was for nothing. I didn't end up finishing either of those side quests, and instead tried to locate some others since the quest log told me that there were 4 more in this area to uncover. I spent about 15 minutes running around looking for these other side quests, but I couldn't find them, so I gave up and progressed the main story, thus failing all 6 of those side quests. What I didn't know was that the other ones wouldn't spawn until I finished the first 2, and when I learned that, I felt good about just continuing the main story and not bothering to stop and engage with that mindless drivel. And guess what? This one story I just told you, that was not the only time I experienced issues like this with the side content. I mean, the main story is interesting and contains events that would really demand the attention of Cloud, Tifa, Barrett, and Aerith, and if the side quests are not interesting, there's no real incentive for the player to halt the main story to go on fetch quests that they will forget about 20 seconds after completing them. However, I am glad at least that you can go back and play the side missions once you finish the main story, and honestly, that seems to be the most appropriate time to tackle a majority of them, as the streets of the Midgar slums are in a total rebuilding mode. Not every side quest is garbage. I'm not saying they're all terrible, but a majority of them are, and it feels like time wasted, and that's a shame. Moving on to the leveling system, I was kind of worried that it may be complex for someone who hasn't played a wealth of JRPGs before, but luckily that wasn't the case at all. Your main stats like attack, magic, and defense level up by set increments every time you level up a character. It's all handled automatically for you, and you're only asked to augment these stats by using skill points to boost certain ones, while also adding new capabilities. For example, I invested heavily in Eris' magic attack stat and chose skills that would boost those numbers while missing out on some of her abilities more prone to healing. This allowed me to make her a more offensive character than she typically would be played as. There's a little bit of wiggle room within these stats to create your own character builds, even if they will mostly be the same across the average build of every player. There's a level cap of 50, I believe, and my characters only reached 35 by the game's conclusion, meaning that you do have to pick and choose what abilities and stat boosts to nab, because you won't get them all by the conclusion of your first playthrough. Besides that, the other thing you'll spend time designing builds around is the weapons and materia you choose to use. I didn't play around with this too much and stuck mostly to the default weapons for each character, especially Cloud and Barret. I mean, Cloud's weapon is iconic, and this was my first playthrough of any Final Fantasy VII content, and so I wasn't eager to give up the Buster Sword too quickly. Still, I was pleased to see that each character has like 5 or more different weapons that they can choose to equip and level up. In fact, that leveling system I mentioned a moment ago is directly tied to the weapon that you're choosing to use, not the individual character, and each comes with different perks, abilities, and special combat moves. The weapon I chose for Aerith is what gave her those boosted attack numbers and allowed me to play her as a more offensive character than she traditionally would be. The different weapons you can purchase or earn allow for experimentation, and will see a lot of use in subsequent playthroughs as you change up your combat builds in interesting ways. You can also equip your weapons and armor with materia, which are magical orbs that give you elemental combat abilities like poisoning foes, throwing fireballs, and assessing enemies. It truly allows for a lot of diversity, and I was very pleased with the leveling system on offer here, alongside of the many different weapon loadouts to choose from. And with that, I think we're finally ready to talk about combat itself, and it's here where I think this game gets a lot of praise, deservedly so, but moving past the surface level assessment of it, I think it's being a little bit miscategorized. I hear the words deep and tactical thrown around a lot when people describe this combat system, but even though the words may be used interchangeably, only one of them is a true descriptor of this combat system. Before we get to that though, let's recap how combat plays out. Gone are the days of mostly random encounters. Instead, you'll stumble into fights against foes in more scripted sections. You'll have anywhere from 1 to 3 members in your party, and go about dispatching foes using both live action attacks as well as turn-based attacks and items. You have a meter called your ATB meter that will fill with each basic or heavy attack that you connect on. Each bar has 2 charges until it's full, and each charge allows you to use a weapon ability, a materia ability, or an item. This system makes combat both live action and somewhat turn-based at the same time, which is a fantastic way to pay homage to the series' roots, while also creating what the developers probably envisioned the combat looking like when they made the original. It really leads to high levels of player interest and attention, because you constantly have to weigh factors like how many charges of ATB do you have? Should you push for 2 charges or use the one you have now? Do you hit an enemy with a magic attack or use a charge to heal up? It's choices like these that players will be dissecting and deciding upon countless times across the game and within each battle itself. The flow of combat feels so natural whether you're selecting a move from the menu or using your basic attack, and that's in part due to the excellent combat animations. You get into this rhythm of switching between your characters and executing the moves you need to. Positioning yourself wisely is also an important factor because your spells and abilities can be interrupted by enemies if you don't time it right, which leads to another level of consideration for the player. What really takes the cake though for me is the sheer amount of enemy variety within this game. There's different enemy categories like Shinra guards, beasts, and machines, and each of them has like 10 or 12 different types of enemies, and the game sprinkles them into the many encounters in unique combinations. It never feels like you're fighting the same enemy over and over again in a monotonous way, but instead, they change it up at just the right amount so that each encounter feels fresh and new. But without a doubt, the boss encounters are what really takes this game to a new level because there are tons of them, and they're meaty, and they're epic, and they're wonderful battles against formidable foes. I mean, boss fights can last up to like 20 minutes in some cases, and they really challenge you to think about their capabilities versus yours and how to execute appropriately in order to, well, execute them. Defeating them gave me a rush that reminded me of defeating bosses in the Souls game. Not necessarily because they're challenging, but just because they feel so damn epic and cool. And I get it, that's not very objective, but damn it, if this game isn't cool as hell, then I don't know what is, and nowhere else does this come across more than in the boss fights. And the best part is, the final 2 hours of this game is pretty much a boss rush where you'll be fighting tons of high-level enemies, and it wraps up the adventure in such a memorable way as each big bad appears even more badass than the last. I was honestly skeptical of this combat system from the demo, but man, it really won me over throughout my actual playthrough and ended up being the best part of the game by far. So I wanted to make that very clear. Combat is spectacular in this game, but it does have 2 issues. The first is the shoddy camera work because this thing will be a pain in the ass more times than you'd like to see. Locking onto targets doesn't center them within your vision, which takes some time to get used to. You do eventually acclimate to it, but it does take quite a while. And there will also be a lot of times where you get backed up into a wall and can't really see anything and it's just terrible. You're almost forced to switch characters at these points. The camera is just not always on your side, and it's important to know that going into the experience. It will hamper it a little bit. My other pause for concern would be that I think to call this combat system tactical is a misuse of that term because it really isn't so on the normal difficulty. At the beginning, you can choose to play on easy, normal, or classic mode, but hard is locked away until New Game Plus, and I think that's a mistake on the developer's part. On normal mode or anything easier, you don't really have to get that tactical with your decision making. The amount of options you have at your disposal runs very deep, with many different summons, materia, weapons, and weapon abilities to use in combat. However, you will barely ever have to rely on strategizing because 90% of the enemies in the game will go down to a spam fury of your basic light and heavy attacks. And just about every enemy can be staggered, opening them up to huge amounts of damage, and it really isn't that hard to get enemies into this vulnerable state by spamming your standard attacks. From there, everything just dies very quickly. Now sure, enemies do have elemental weaknesses, but this feels pretty basic and just serves as another option to fill stagger meters very quickly. Really, the only tactical maneuver you have to make is ensuring that your party's health stays relatively high, especially in boss fights where enemies can one-shot you with massively powerful attacks. So if you're going into this experience hoping for tactical involvement, you really won't find that much of it. Instead, you'll find a whole heap of options, most of which you won't ever use in any given playthrough. It does, however, offer replayability, which is never a bad thing. And so maybe I shouldn't have called that an issue. It's more of just something that you should be aware of if you intend to buy this game. The options are deep, but the combat isn't really tactical. And of course, I should give the disclaimer that that's true for normal mode and anything easier, but hard mode does probably require more tactics because items aren't usable, so you're going to have to spend more time planning and strategizing. But since it's locked off until New Game Plus, you won't really have to worry about it on your first playthrough. And again, that's why I think it was a critical mistake of making hard mode being locked away until New Game Plus. And so, while the exploration is basic and the side quests are laughable, the combat does plenty to keep you wanting more. Now that I have finished the game, I do intend to at least check out hard mode, simply because I want to engage with this combat system more. It's really fun. It's rarely difficult or normal mode, but it gives you a true power trip sometimes when you wipe the floor with basic mobs, and simultaneously it can make you feel like David beating Goliath when you take down some of these bosses. I truly don't think I've had a game's combat system resonate with me this much since playing Horizon Zero Dawn in 2017, which won Game of the Year for me then, so that's high praise in my book. 7 Remake is an incredibly beautiful game most of the time, and its soundtrack is pretty good as well. But there are design limitations that feel out of place for a game releasing in 2020. Starting with the graphics, this game is incredibly beautiful, whether it's showing off the desolate slum towns, the glowing greenish aura of a Mako generator room, the hustling streets of Wall Market, or the sleek walls and structures of Shinra HQ. I mean, you have 2 eyes. You can see for yourself how good it looks. It's incredible. And it's evident that a lot of time and love went into this game to make sure it stunned players with its visuals. The final locations of the game in particular really had me stopping to admire how well it was constructed, and it had me really studying the environment to appreciate it more. Oh, and some of the skyboxes are absolutely immaculate. Some of the best I've ever seen. In terms of character animations, it's all pretty standard and pretty good, although I do think the lip syncing is off in a few different parts. In terms of other issues, there are some downright ugly textures in the game, and I'm not sure what happened with them, but they will crop up from time to time. Also, the pop-in does get a little rough sometimes in the town sections where people will just literally pop into view 5 steps in front of you. It's noticeable, but by no means a deal breaker. In terms of music, most of the tracks are also well done, and I like just about all of them, especially the main menu theme. The only piece I didn't love was the theme for Wall Market, which I thought got repetitive and annoying over time.
I feel so alive watching those.
How about it?
Can't have just one. The more you eat, the better they get. Fresh chocobo bean popcorn.
But outside of that one, the pieces were pretty awesome. The sounds of combat feel appropriate as well and never took me out of the experience. It all blended in seamlessly with the action. I also have to give props to the voice acting because I think they just about nailed everyone and they were all casted perfectly. Especially Barrett, he takes home the gold for me. He's just so likable, and it comes through with how he's written and how he's performed.
Where's Marlene? Is she here?
Barrett.
Sorry, I'm Barrett. Marlene's my little girl. Marlene, she's got short hair. She's cute as a button, with the heart of an angel. She was wearing, pink pink. She was wearing a
She's
pink dress
sleeping
today.
upstairs.
Oh,
I said she's sleeping.
Anyway, I don't have a lot else to say about the music and sound in games usually, so I'll just stick with that. I liked it. What I didn't like, though, were some of the design limitations that the game chose to put to work. There are so many areas with invisible walls where it feels like I should be able to go down paths, but I just can't. I understand that not every game is going to give us complete freedom to traverse every inch of the map, but it does feel pretty jarring for a game in 2020 to have these sorts of issues after so many titles have moved away from them. The experience is so linear that sometimes it feels like a detriment is all. There's also those weird hiccup moments where you reach a new objective marker and your character just kind of shuffles in place until the cutscene tied to the marker is loaded in and ready to play. These are minor issues, of course, but you do notice them simply because moving around the world can feel pretty slow-paced compared to the fast-paced action of combat. Finally, in terms of bugs and glitches, I didn't really notice too many. There was that time when the objective marker spawned over an NPC that wasn't there, but I think that's more tied to the fact that I didn't complete the necessary quest to make that guy spawn. But there was one boss fight where Aerith fell through the map and was stuck in this white void where I couldn't really do anything with her. She couldn't attack, she couldn't move, she couldn't heal anyone, and it kind of sucked because her magic attacks were the most effective thing I had against that particular boss. I was able to win without dying, but it was a nuisance. But that was really the only performance issue I experienced while playing on my PS4 Pro. And I don't really know where else to put this in the review, so I want to wrap this section up by quickly mentioning that there has to be a ton, and I mean a ton, of little winks and nods to the original game that fans will love. As a newcomer to the series, I really couldn't tell you many of them, but I'm certain that they are there, and would love to hear about your favorite in the comments below. For me, I absolutely loved the first time I heard Barrett loudly sing the Final Fantasy victory tune after defeating a horde of mutated bugs in the train tunnels. I really can't imagine how much joy that must have brought for longtime fans, and I guarantee there's other things just like that throughout the adventure that I simply won't be able to pick up on, but that you will greatly appreciate. Starting to wrap this video up now, and I must admit that I was surprised to have enjoyed the Final Fantasy VII Remake as much as I did. The combat system was electrifying and had me hooked and wanting more. It may not have been as tactical as some may have hoped, but that doesn't make it bad by any stretch of the imagination. The story is self-contained and has a beginning, middle, and end that feels acceptable for the first entry into this new set of games. Our characters have highs and lows while also leaving room for more to come without making this single story feel incomplete, which is praiseworthy. The presentation of the world and the characters is really well done, and the game's design only struggles in a few ways that don't amount to much more than nitpicks. What really sold me on this title was the fantastic boss encounters and our cast of characters who really draw you in. They're just likable people, and the supporting cast ain't so bad either. In terms of negatives, some of the antagonists feel forgotten when the credits roll, and major gameplay sequences like side quests are a drag, which is a shame. The game is able to overcome these issues though, and stands tall as a worthwhile experience to have in 2020. I was not sold by the demo when I played it, but I opted to purchase the game anyway, simply because I knew how monumental its release was for many people across the industry. And now that I've finally finished it, I'm happy to say that Final Fantasy VII Remake is a game that can be enjoyed, thoroughly I might add, even by complete newcomers to the series. And that's going to be the end of this video, ladies and gentlemen. Before I go, I must admit, normally I like to come up with some kind of catchy title for these reviews, something that I think is, clever and fits the game. But in this case, I was gonna name this video My First Fantasy because this was my first Final Fantasy game, but then I thought about it more. I was like, ugh, My First Fantasy. That probably wouldn't be a good thing to name this game. So I'm sorry there's no clever title this time. But anyway, thank you so much for watching. Please leave a like if you enjoyed the video. Consider subscribing for more. Follow me on Twitter at NoobNabNarb. And as always, have a nice day and take care.